about living and moving and have our being in God, the first thing that comes to mind is that we often act as if we don't know this to be true. Like we have no idea that we live and move and have our being in God. I think that because so often remembering that we live and move and have our being in God, instead we seem to think of God as being somewhat distant from us. We talk about finding God, as if God might have gotten lost someplace. Or we think about seeking God, as if God purposely hides for us and will only show up if we can locate that one special hiding place. Or we pray for God to come down to us. Or we sometimes wonder where God is as we go about living and moving and having our being in this earthly life. As I think about this mistaken notion we have of a God far off, it reminds me of a fish story. It's a very brief fish story. It's a little parable that was told by a journalist named David Foster Wallace. He told it at the beginning of a commencement speech that he gave at Kenyon College back in 2005. The parable goes like this. There are these two young fish just swimming along in the water, and they happen to meet an older fish who is swimming the opposite direction. The older fish nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit. Then eventually, one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the heck is water?" Like the fish. We are sometimes so blind to the reality that God is the living water in which we swim that we don't even know we're swimming in the water already. This is what Luke is talking about in the reading we heard this morning from Acts. He's talking about a sermon that Paul gave when Paul was in Athens. Because he was in Athens, Paul was preaching to an audience that was steeped in Greek culture. And in Greek culture, the ancient culture of Greece, deity of gods and goddesses were thought about as being these supernatural super figures separate from humankind who could use those powers any way they wanted, at any time they wanted, to intervene in what was going on in this earth, or to simply fight among themselves. They could impose their will, for good or for ill, among themselves, upon humankind, and upon the world. However, Paul says he's introducing a different way. He compares it to what they think of sometimes as an unknown God, because in that culture they wanted to cover all the bases. And so they realized there could be something they didn't already know. So Paul starts there with, let me tell you about this unknown God, because this is what I know. And he introduces a way of thinking about God being in a very close relationship with the world. Paul introduces the thinking that was rooted in ancient Judaism and embodied in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Paul teaches that God is in a close and personal relationship with humankind and the world. A relationship constituted within an ever-living, ever-loving, grace-filled divine presence. A presence not far from us, an ever-present presence. Paul says, that's what we live and move and have our being in, is that ever-present presence of divine self-giving and is graceful. In our reading from the Gospel of John this morning, we hear John elaborate on that and come at it from a slightly different perspective. John fleshes out this inextricable interconnectedness of an ever-present divine presence. A divine presence that permeates every aspect of this world, every aspect of God's creation. John is reflecting on the words that Jesus had probably spoken in one form or another, certainly taught, not only in teachings we think of as wisdom teachings, but through parables of nature and all sorts of ways. John is reflecting on this, and what he remembers of that is that what Jesus was trying to get across was that he often taught that we live and move and have our being in this world within God, but also God lives and moves and has God's being within us and within the creation. The psalmist, one psalmist, we didn't read this psalm today, but the psalmist that wrote 139 had sort of the same sense of God in everything and everything in God. As the psalmist said, where can I go then from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I climb up to heaven, you are there. If I make the grave my bed, you are there also. If I take the wings of morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there, your hand will lead me, and your right hand hold me fast. We and all creation are never separated from the living, moving, and being of God. Because there is no place and there is no time when God is not present with us. Living and moving around us, above us, beside us, and yes, within us, and within the entirety of creation. And as God lives and moves and has God's being within all that is, God seeks to nudge us in every moment of our life so that God can guide us in directions that will contribute to the well-being of this incredible creation that flows out of God. At the same time, however, we know that human beings and all sentient creatures have some degree of freedom, some ability to make their own choices for living, moving, and being. And these choices happen moment by moment as we interact with each other and with all creation. It's not the same idea as that ancient Greek idea, though that kind of got carried over through the years. Not the same idea of some supernatural power swooping down to override everything that the Creator has made and make things different. But instead, that ever-present presence, seeking, as Jesus once said, to gather the brood under the divine wing as a mother hen gathers her brood. And this happens not just once, but every moment of every day. Moment by moment, we can look and listen for the divine nudge to say and to do what is possible in that moment for us to say and do that would contribute rather than detract from the well-being of all. Moment by moment, we can choose to collaborate with God and bring about some amount of well-being, even if it's just for that moment. We may not be able to do it for the whole world for all the time, but the whole world for all time depends upon all the small moments and all of creation. God does not go absent from the moments of our lives. But in moments of great opportunity, we often go blind to God. Sometimes such moments of opportunity loom large. On this Mother's Day, I think of a 19th century mother named Isabella Baumfree. Born into slavery, Baumfree escaped with her infant daughter to freedom in 1826, then went to court, which was unheard of for a freed black woman, especially. went to court to regain her son in 1828 and won the case. That on June 1st, 1843, which happened to be Pentecost Sunday, Isabel Longfree changed her name. She changed her name to Sojourner Truth. And she set out to travel the country advocating for the complete abolition of slavery. She told her friends that she heard the Spirit of God calling her to go out far and wide to preach the truth of what slavery did. She said, "The Spirit calls me and I must go." Yes, sometimes the moments of opportunity loom large. But most of the time, for most of us, the opportunities we have that we can choose or not choose to collaborate with God for the well-being of all, these opportunities for us usually come in smaller moments of our lives. Such an opportunity to choose collaboration with God comes each time we're in the midst of a heated argument with a friend or a loved one. At these times, we are inclined to think that our only two choices are to either win or lose the argument, and we proceed accordingly. But the truth is, neither of those two choices, whether we win it or the other person wins it and we lose it, neither of those two choices does much for the well-being of anyone. Such an opportunity comes each time we find ourselves disagreeing with the decisions made by some group that we belong to. And at these times, we are inclined to think that our only two choices are either to just leave the group or to stay and make our displeasure known in ways that are sarcastic or disdainful, or at least accusational, accusing the people who made the decisions of motives that we assume they might have had that they probably never even thought of. They just were seeing something differently than we had seen. All of these are choices we can make when the group we belong to does something we disagree with. But none of them, leaving or staying with disdain, none of them contribute to the well-being of all. Such an opportunity comes up each time we're tempted to think that the only two choices we have in a situation is either to blame ourselves or someone else. To blame, and not only to blame, but to blame and shame. We usually do both together. And the truth is, there's certainly more possibilities than simply blaming and shaming either ourselves or somebody else. And blame and shame, whether pointed to ourselves or others, only subtracts from the ability to bring about the wellness of all. So what do? I mean, if the way to ensure the well-being of all isn't about winning or losing our arguments for what we think is the well-being, and if the way to bring it about isn't about either leading those groups that don't do it the way we think they should, or making sure that they know we think they're idiots for saying what they say, or if the only way we know to bring about the way of well-being is to make sure that we find out who's to blame and blame them, whether it's ourselves or them that we think should be to blame, if that's not the way that brings about the well-being of all, what is? For many, the prayer of St. Francis serves as a good reminder of what to ask for in these moments. It starts simply by asking God to use us in that moment to make us an instrument of peace. And whenever we say peace in a prayer, we mean more than the absence of conflict. We mean the well-being of all. The shalom, the salam, the well-being of all. The ones that we would shame, the ones that we would blame, the ones that we would accuse, the ones that we would deny, the ones that we would win against. Make us instruments of that peace of the Lord. And when we give God even that little bitty opening, I think it's more likely that the rest of that prayer presents us with possibilities we may not have thought of. I'm a mother, and I'm a grandmother. And my hope for each of my children, for all two of my granddaughters, and for all of you, my hope for all of us is that from moment to moment in our lives, we might learn to take a breath, to look and to listen. They always say before a railroad track, stop, look and listen. To look and listen for ways in which God may just be nudging us to collaborate with God in that moment. Not to win, not to blame, not to leave or disdain, but to be grace-filled enough to do or say what will bring about the well-being of all parties in that moment. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, unity. Where there is doubt, faith, meaning trust. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console. That we may not seek so much to be understood as to understand. That we may not seek so much to be loved as to love. For it is in pardoning that we ourselves are pardoned. And as I've told you many times, according to the pattern of the universe, it is in dying that we are born to new